Jujutsu Kaisen is probably one of the most heavily debated animes on the internet, and nothing makes people accuse each other of not reading the manga faster than bringing up the domain expansion. Sukuna cheats, Megami's domain is fake, and Hakari's is rigged. Sure hits cannot miss, except for all the times they do. The problem isn't that the story isn't well written enough, more so that the rules of the domain expansion are scattered across dozens of fights, binding vows, barrier conditions, and numerous exceptions. And missing any one of those details can completely change how you perceive what happened. Quick spoiler warning, this video goes all the way through to the original manga's ending, so if you're not caught up, I will be putting skip points on screen for those who are anime only. 2 videos ago, I explained how barriers wall off a space and their relation to real-life mathematics and geometry. Last video, I explained how domains work and their relationship to the barrier, the imbue technique, their sure hit effect, how binding vows shape the domain, and even went into domain clashes. Now, I want to run every domain that we have seen, or almost seen, through that exact same framework. But there's a second layer too that I haven't touched on yet. A character's domain might tell you how they fight, but their activation seal can hint to what the story might want you to read about them. If you don't already know, a lot of the Jujutsu Kaisen hanseis are clearly inspired and drawn from Buddhist mudras. Now, most of these deity identifications are not confirmed by the manga or Gege at all, so I'll be trying my best to separate the iconographic reading from what's actually confirmed. Now, with that established, we can start with the newest domain in the series, Yuji Itadori. The series never gives this domain expansion a name, but structurally it works, as we see the barrier close and we know that there's a technique imbued, and the guaranteed hit is given to his dismantle technique. More specifically, dismantle is tuned at the boundary between the souls, the exact boundary Yuji needs to target if he wants to succeed in separating Megami from Sukuna. Based on everything we were given, the domain appears to recreate places from Yuji's hometown. The station, the streets, the memories he walks Sukuna through. It's important to know that that scenery is not the attack, but simply Yuji's last attempt at reaching his opponent before him. His own talk no jutsu, if you will. Unfortunately, no attack is really clearly shown. When the fight ends, Megami is separated from Sukuna, so the implication is clear. Unfortunately, the original manga never paused to explain what exactly happened. Now, I did see some things floating online saying that Yuji opened his domain in Modulo. However, that's not really confirmed either, as what happened in Modulo was Mahito attempted to open his domain, and Yuji countered with dismantle before Mahito could even open his domain. What we do have is Yuji's hand sign. My favorite part about Yuji's hand sign is that it closely mirrors Sukuna, except the referenced deity is Shitigarba. If you don't know, Shitigarba is the deity who vowed to descend down to hell and rescue the souls who were trapped there. And the reason that I love that it mirrors Sukuna's hand sign is because Sukuna's is referencing the Buddhist deity Yama, or the king of hell, otherwise known as the king or the judge of the dead. So in a way, Shitigarba mirrors Yuji's role in this fight, as Megami is buried deep into Sukuna's inner world and Yuji has to reach in there to rescue him. And I love that parallel of Sukuna being the judge of the dead and Yuji going in to rescue them. Same visual language, but opposite moral role. Moving on to Jogo's Coffin of the Iron Mountain. This is one of the cleanest conventional domains in the series. It has a closed barrier, Jogo's volcanic technique imbued into the domain, and an environment so hot that an average sorcerer would burn up just being inside. I think it's worth separating the ambient environment and the sure hit effect here. See, the volcano itself attacks through heat, then the walls and magma also radiate heat at you from every direction, and then on top of that, Jogo commands molten rock, which uses the domain's sure hit effect. So the room is already lethal before anything happens, then the barrier guarantees an aimed attack on top of that. Bear with me if I'm mispronouncing anything and feel free to correct me in the comments down below. But Jogo's seal is commonly compared to Daikokuten. Daikokuten is a figure in Japan that developed from the wrathful Mahakala. He also eventually became conflated with Okunushi, eventually turning into the god of wealth, fortune, and household prosperity, also known as one of the 7 lucky gods. Now, the manga doesn't confirm any of this, but I think the irony fits Jogo especially well. Though Jogo sees himself as destructive, he doesn't believe his goal to be meaningfully destructive. See, Jogo believes that by removing humanity, it'll make way for curses to live in a brand new world. So a figure carrying both destruction and prosperity is more than just a random lucky god joke. In a sense, Jogo is trying to create a better world, it's just a better world for monsters. Where Jogo's domain turns the environment against you, the Smallpox Deity tries to kill you by forcing you through a procedure. The Smallpox Deity's domain is compact, but it is complete. It traps its target into a coffin, buries them, drops a gravestone on them, and then begins a countdown. If the victim doesn't manage to escape before the sequence is complete, then the technique infects and kills them. Now then, I'm an engineer, so I have to draw an engineering comparison, and the cleanest comparison I can draw is a state machine. Start with the coffin, move to the burial, then the gravestone, start the countdown, once that completes, death. Each satisfied condition advances the process to the next state. Escape before the terminal state, and the sequence has to run again. Now, there is no documented hand sign here, but I think the deeper symbolism is in the name itself, which draws on Japanese smallpox folklore, including stories around the Amazake Baba. Sorry for reading that one. Now, that distinction matters, as not every domain has to point back to a Buddhist deity. Here, the horror comes from folk ritual, disease, burial, and inevitability. And so once a domain can kill you by forcing a process instead of a lethal hit, the rules around domains start to get a little bit stranger, which brings me to Naoya Zenin's Time Cell Moon Palace. After returning as a cursed spirit spirit, Naoya opens Time Cell Moon Palace as a normal lethal domain, though nothing seems to happen at first and his opponents assume that something failed. The moment they try to move, they begin bleeding and realize the domain has struck. This domain injects Projection Sorcerer's 24 FPS rule into every recognized target. See, the movement of each target has to remain legible across each discrete frame. The domain amplifies Naoya's technique so that it is applied at the cellular level, meaning even the movements of the cells of the target has to remain legible across those discrete frames as well. Violate the sequence and the punishment is applied, producing spontaneous wounds the instant the target moves incorrectly. We don't see this domain for very long though, because Maki waddles through untouched, and speed is not her reason. Because her heavenly restriction leaves her with 0 cursed energy, the domain doesn't recognize her as a target and treats her as a wall or ordinary object, physically present but not a valid cursed energy target. So she's able to enter the domain unharmed and kill Naoya instantly. Editor Matthew here with a quick correction. So I initially compared the hand sign to the deity Chuzma, but that's actually wrong, as this more commonly associated with the deity Gigaiten, the Buddhist goddess of art, talent, and skill performance. Now this fits Naoya almost perfectly. See, his technique, Projection Sorcery, essentially allows him to turn action into an animation, dividing 1 second into 24 frames, and he decides the choreography of his opponents. If they break that choreography, then they're frozen into a single animation frame. So Naoya's entire technique is built around perfect action. You move exactly like the technique demands or you're punished. And that makes the connection to Gigaiten seem pretty fitting. She literally represents mastery and precision in performance. It also creates an interesting contrast with Mahito, who uses a similar hand sign. But the two approach perfection in very different ways. Where Naoya is chasing perfect action and performance, Mahito is trying to embody that perfection. And there's one little final bit of irony here for our favorite feminist. Gigaiten is a female deity. Back to the video. So where Naoya punishes you for moving wrong, Higuruma punishes you for answering wrong. Higuruma's deadly sentencing turns the domain into a courtroom. Violence is prohibited until the trial ends, and attacking simply returns the offender back to their podium. His domain also has a binding vow that requires him to explain the rules to his target, because of course the trial can't begin with the defendant completely uninformed. His domain also comes with the Shikigami Judgment. Once the trial begins, Judgment will announce a real accusation from the defendant's history, and the defendant gets one response, either silence, confession, or denial. Then Higuruma receives a piece of evidence he can use in rebuttal. The only one who knows what truly happened is Judgment. Higuruma does not. So Higuruma still has to build his case, which is a terrible matchup for anybody opposing a former defense lawyer, nonetheless one in Japan. It is described in the manga that this is closer to the older form of domain expansions. Earlier domains were often non-lethal, where instead of having a guaranteed attack, they would guarantee participation into the technique's rules. It's explained that modern lethal domains are much more difficult to construct, which helps explain why domain expansions became much rarer as time went on. So Higuruma's courtroom is not an unfinished lethal domain, it's the old rule enforcement template operating at a very high level. Back to the actual domain. A guilty verdict can trigger confiscation, which will either remove a cursed technique or the target's cursed energy. If the target is carrying a cursed tool, then confiscation can also target that instead. It is important to note that confiscation can only do one of these at a time, or at least one per guilty ruling. It's important to note that the charges are seemingly randomized, or at least decided by Judgment without Higuruma's knowledge or control. A sufficiently severe charge can also grant the death penalty, which summons the Executioner Sword, a tool which kills the sentenced soul if Higuruma can land one clean hit. But that procedure is more than the price of the domain. See, the Executioner Sword reflects Higuruma's relationship with the law. He spent his entire career defending people from an unjust system. Yet in his own domain, he stands opposite as the prosecutor. And even then, he's not truly in control, as Judgment decides everything, forcing Higuruma to operate within another system at which he cannot control. See, the courtroom recreates the contradiction that broke him. Judgment looms above everybody as a supposed symbol of impartial justice, while guillotines hang in the background, making the threat of punishment impossible to separate from the trial itself. Yuji's conviction proves the domain can produce a valid guilty verdict that Higuruma knows is morally wrong. Deadly sentencing represents Higuruma's lost faith that following the correct procedure will always lead to justice. Now, where Higuruma's guaranteed effect makes you obey a trial, Hakari's makes you understand the rules of his game. Hakari's idle death gamble does not begin by damaging the opponent. Its guaranteed hit transfers the rules of his pachinko game directly into their mind. The information itself is harmless, which allows the domain to deploy extra quickly, which also gives Hakari an advantage in domain clashes. So the victim is forced to understand the system, but whether that understanding helps them or not is a different story. The game itself is modeled after a fictional romance manga and uses a pachinko probability loop. The commonly quoted jackpot rate is 1 in 239, but that's only for the base machine and not the full practical system. See, this game has reach indicators, scenario modes, probability shifts, and guaranteed sequences that all change what a particular attempt means. It's much closer to a gacha system with hidden invisible modifiers than it is to a clean casino game. When Hakari lands matching symbols, he is granted unlimited curse energy for exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The runtime of Admiring You, which is the domain's theme song. This theme song is also playing within the domain, so his opponent can hear it as well. His body reflexively performs reverse curse technique throughout that period, which constantly heals him. This makes him extraordinarily difficult to kill, despite Hakari never learning a reverse curse technique himself. My favorite part about this domain is probably the song's fictional writing credit. See, it's credited to Eita Tarakuri, whose name in Japanese order is Tarakuri Eita, a phonetic riff on Tyler the Creator. Hakari's activation seal is commonly associated with the deity Benzaiten, a Buddhist deity commonly associated with music, wealth, and good fortune. The symbolism here perfectly complements his domain, a game of chance that rewards him in overwhelming abundance, while a theme song plays for the duration of his jackpot. Hakari's idle death gamble transforms his obsession with fever into a ritual where luck generates momentum, and getting one jackpot creates the opportunity for another. Hakari guarantees you know the rules, where Dagon guarantees the attack doesn't even exist until it's already reached you. Dagon's horizon of the captivating Skandha is the tropical beach where the disaster curses have been meeting since early in the story. See, Dagon was born from humanity's fear of water-based disasters. Yet his inner world is not a violent storm or a tsunami, it's a calm ocean with no humans in sight. To Dagon and his friends, this domain serves as a refuge, just a small preview of the peaceful world the curses believe they deserve. That same paradise becomes horrifying once humans are placed inside of it. Dagon's ability Death Swarm turns the ocean into an environment where humans are its prey. Its aquatic Shikigami do not appear to exist until the instant they bite. I wouldn't describe it as the fish are moving extremely fast, rather the barrier is removing the interval between the attack being summoned and making contact. Dagon can also distribute his swarm deliberately, assigning 70% to Mahito and 30% to Hanami. So this is a targeted attack and not an indiscriminate flood. Mahito initially survives because he has Falling Blossom Emotion. I didn't touch on this in my last video, mostly because I forgot about it, my bad. But it's also very similar to Simple Domain. Falling Blossom Emotion automatically releases cursed energy the moment these Shikigami make contact and destroys them as they materialize. The domain activation also demonstrates that a hand sign is a requirement and not just decorative symbolism. Because Mahito destroyed Dagon's hands before he can even complete it, Dagon was forced to draw the curse seal across his stomach instead, opening the domain through an alternate route. Supplemental material identifies this seal as a hotai, or a treasure pouch, that does fit a domain that is continuously pouring out aquatic Shikigami, although the manga never directly explains the connection. See, it's the domain's name that carries the stronger symbolic layer. In Buddhism, the 5 skandhas are form, perception, sensation, mental formations, and consciousness, without forming a permanent soul. Now that is especially fitting for a being like Dagon, one who was formed from humanity's accumulated fear of water, who evolves from a cursed womb while insisting the disaster curses possess names and identities. His domain spreads that constructed self all the way to the horizon, a beautiful refuge where curses can gather as friends and humans have no place but as prey. Now, this rating is inferred and not confirmed, but I like to think Horizon of the Captivating Skandha is Dagon's claim to personhood. He's not merely creating a favorable terrain, but rather creating a world he believes the curses deserve to inherit. Speaking of disaster curses, let's talk about the strongest among them, Mahito. Mahito's self-embodiment of perfection turns touch from an action into a property of the environment itself. See, normally idle transfiguration requires Mahito to make contact in order for it to work. Inside his domain, however, the barrier is constructed from hands, meaning everybody trapped inside is already being held at the level of the soul. Nanami's description of being inside the domain is literal. Entering this domain means placing yourself in the palm of Mahito's hand. That is also why Yuji entering immediately backfires. See, Mahito didn't just make contact with Yuji, but also the other soul residing within his body, Sukuna. Though his domain gives him absolute access, it does not grant Mahito absolute authority. The second Mahito got to say hello to Sukuna, he immediately retaliated. The repeated hands are also a perfect expression of how Mahito understands the body. To even activate his domain, he opens his mouth and summons 4 smaller arms to form 2 hand signs, a ritual that would be impossible if not for Mahito reshaping his own soul. Ayo, I'm back again. Sorry, I completely forgot to talk about Mahito's hand signs, but I've already mentioned one and how it closely mirrors Naoya's hand sign and is associated with the deity Gigaiten. The other hand sign represents the deity Maitreya, who is supposed to be the future Buddha, someone who is destined to reach enlightenment one day. So both of Mahito's hand seals point back to this idea of reaching some higher perfected state. And I touch on this here in a second when I talk about the Japanese name of the domain, but I like to think that on one hand we have Maitreya, who is supposed to one day reach enlightenment, and Mahito is trying to force that with the other hand sign, chasing perfection. The activation itself therefore demonstrates idle transfiguration. Mahito doesn't adapt his technique to the body, rather he adapts his body to use his technique. Once the domain opens, those hands multiply into enormous interlocked arms surrounding the target. One hand to represent the contact Mahito normally needs, countless hands to create a world in which escaping that contact is impossible. Everyone inside has already been reduced to something he can hold, examine, and reshape. The domain's Japanese name adds another layer. Endon is a Buddhist term describing complete and immediate enlightenment. See, Mahito is a newborn cursed that is obsessed with learning the true shape of the soul, and every major fight brings him closer to what he perceives as his perfected form. And I think that fits perfectly, as self-embodiment of perfection is his own corrupted enlightenment, a closed world where his understanding of the soul becomes absolute, and every other person only exists to be remade by it. Now, Mahito still needs a closed space to put everyone inside of his hands. Kenjaku shows you what happens when that shell disappears. Kenjaku's womb profusion belongs to the same rare structural class as Malevolent Shrine. as it manifests without enclosing its target into a conventional outer shell. The grotesque central structure is made from faces and pregnant-like corpses, although the domain's imbue technique is never confirmed. Now, I would like to believe that this is Geto's technique, but it's never really confirmed, as Kenjaku is known to have numerous techniques that none of us know about, and he can just pull out the perfect one at the right time, so long as he is aware. Now, what I can speak on is what does happen when the domain is shown. Now, the guaranteed effect shown during the fight slams Yuki to the ground, strong enough to destroy her simple domain and damage her with impact comparable to maximum Uzumaki. Kenjaku using an open structure is what defeats Tengen's initial plan. See, there is no normal outer shell for the greatest barrier specialist in the series to grab onto and dismantle, forcing Tengen to have to search for the boundary of the guaranteed effect, the place where the domain's influence actually stops, and use that measurable edge to collapse it. Kenjaku's activation seal is commonly identified as the Hansha Gaso. I could be mispronouncing that, I'm sorry. One of the 12 Gasho in esoteric Buddhism. Unlike many other domain hand signs, however, this is a basic ritual hand configuration and not associated with any particular deity. The stronger symbolic layers in the domain's name and imagery. Its Japanese title, Taizo Hanya, translated as womb profusion, appears to invoke the Buddhist womb realm. Excuse me, I'm going to be reading for a moment. In esoteric Buddhism, the womb realm mandala represents Buddha's great compassion for nurturing the innate potential for awakening. Kenjaku turns that promise inside out. His domain manifests as a grotesque pillar of fused faces and pregnant-like corpses, transforming womb's birth and creation into accumulated human material. Across this 1,000-year project, Kenjaku repeatedly treats birth as an experiment, from the death paintings to even burying Yuji in Kaori's body. Kenjaku doesn't need a shell, Megami can't make one, and Yorozu sits somewhere between them with a conventional domain built around an impossible object. Yorozu's threefold affliction applies this guaranteed effect to the object she creates with construction. In her final fight, that means true sphere, a theoretically perfect sphere with no contact area, thus creating infinite pressure. That infinite pressure is also generated to anything it makes contact with. Her technique construction creates matter out of cursed energy, which is famously inefficient. Her insect armor is actually a smart engineering workaround. Instead of spending energy on a human-shaped solution, just borrow from biological structures that have already solved that problem. And this armor works great for covering speed, mobility, and protection efficiency. Though her domain guaranteed true sphere to reach Sukuna, guaranteed contact doesn't necessarily mean guaranteed success. Mahoraga was adapting to construction throughout the fight, so when Sukuna summoned the adapted Shikigami, it destroyed the sphere before it could even do anything. Yorozu's activation seal has several competing Buddhist identifications, so I wouldn't assign one deity as a fact. The stronger symbolism again comes from the domain's name. See, threefold affliction in Japanese is pronounced shiku shiku shiku, a deliberate repetition sounding like sick sick sick. In Yorozu's case, this is lovesickness taken to the most dangerous extreme. Yorozu insists that she alone can be the one to teach Sukuna about love, but her version of love leaves no room for what he wants. Her domain transforms that obsession into its guaranteed hit. She creates a perfect sphere in a world where Sukuna must accept it. She calls it true love, but mechanically it's love stripped of consent and made unavoidable. Threefold affliction doesn't represent salvation through love. It represents Yorozu's inability to differentiate loving someone from possessing them. Where Yorozu can close a domain around an impossible object, Megami still can't close one at all. Megami's Chimera Shadow Garden is the only incomplete domain we see in the series. Because he cannot form a complete closed barrier, he is not granted a guaranteed effect. So, every Shikigami made in physical attack still has to connect normally. Instead, Megami has to rely on an existing structure, whether that be a gymnasium, a cave, or any closable structure. Inside the domain, the 10 Shadows technique expands throughout the environment. He can create multiple copies of his Shikigami, move through shadows, generate decoys, and even flood the space with a liquid shadow that offers no buoyancy and no air. The cost, however, is very real. Anything stored within Megami's shadow, he still has to bear its weight. We saw this in his fight against Reggie, where Reggie created multiple cars to weigh Megami down, and Megami countered by summoning Max Elephant and turning the fight into a load competition. A complete barrier might be able to define and distribute the space on its own, but Megami's improvised system has nowhere else to send the load. Now, Megami normally summons a Shikigami by shaping their silhouettes with his hand. If you haven't noticed already, this hand size he uses to summon a Shikigami actually form the shadow puppets they're based on. In Chimera Shadow Garden, however, he doesn't have to use his hand signs to summon a Shikigami. Because the entire environment becomes his shadow, it allows his Shikigami, clones, and even Megami to emerge from the same medium. His domain activation seal also has a credible Buddhist identification. It's commonly matched with the seal of Yakushi Nayori, but the connection reaches directly into the mythology behind 10 Shadows. Yakushi is recognized as the medicine Buddha and is protected by the 12 heavenly generals, including Makora, the namesake behind Divine General Mahoraga. The seal therefore points beyond Megami's individual summons, and toward the complete inherited system he's still learning to manifest. Chimera Shadow Garden is that potential taking shape. Though Megami never finishes his domain on screen, the next group is even stranger, as we have 4 characters that are confirmed to possess a domain, but the story never shows us what those domains actually do. To keep it simple, I'm gonna dub these the ghost domains. Now this section is deliberately different, as Hanami, Uro, Yuki, and Jane Juliet are all confirmed to possess domain expansions, but none of their domains actually resolve in the manga. Hanami's is interrupted before it ever forms, Uro and Ryu successfully activate theirs, but we see it collapse before it ever stabilizes, and Yuki just never opens hers at all. What survives though is activation, hand signs, and later adaptation imagery. Let's start with Hanami, who activated her domain during the Kyoto Goodwill event. Gojo managed to destroy the curtain in the exact moment that Hanami opened her domain, forcing Hanami to abandon activation and retreat. The manga never shows any hand seals, so there is no mudra to identify. It is also never officially named on page. However, the official fanbook later supplied the name Shining Sea of Growing Branches. The name evokes an entire landscape of growing branches and light, the world that Hanami believes should flourish once humanity leaves. Like Dagon's beach, it appears to represent the natural curse's paradise as opposed to the disaster humans fear. There was also showing in the licensed game Phantom's Paradise, but I'm not going to get into that. Takako Uro reaches much further. She, Ryo, and Yuta all opened their domains during their clash in Sendai. Unfortunately, these domains collapsed before we saw them complete. Now, the anime did add some blue and white imagery, which adds, but I don't think it gives enough information to actually say what this domain does. Her activation seal, however, has a much stronger identification. Her crossed arms reproduce the seal of Gundari Miyu, one of Buddhism's 5 wisdom kings. Gundari is typically depicted with multiple arms as snakes wrapped around their body. They have the power to subdue obstacles in defense of Buddhist law. I love the possible irony of Uro using the sign of a guardian. See, in her first life, she commanded the assassination squad of the Fujiwara clan, eliminating its enemies before being framed and discarded herself. She once lived to serve as someone else's weapon, and in her second life in the Culling Games, she is driven by the desire to finally live for her own identity. Jane Juliet activates in that same moment. This domain also remains unnamed. The anime briefly represents it with fireworks, and I think that imagery is fitting for someone whose technique is about explosive output, but this remains anime-only imagery rather than the actual domain interior. Ryu's activation seal is commonly compared to Mahama Yuri, who is known as the Peacock Wisdom King, but that comparison isn't really stable. Other comparisons have also circulated. Mahama Yuri is commonly associated with protection from disease, poison, and disaster, but it couldn't really draw enough from Ryu's technique to reconstruct a domain from that symbolism. So the fireworks kind of tell us more than Ryu's disputed mudra does. Yuki Tsukumo is the purest unknown. She is one of the only 4 modern sorcerers classified as a special grade and is explicitly confirmed to have a domain expansion. But instead of giving everybody what they wanted, she decided to listen to Tengen's plan and lose anyways. Instead of using her own domain against Kenjaku, she listened to Tengen and used simple domain instead, only for Kenjaku to immediately strip that defense away. Now, because Yuki never began her activation, we never got a domain name, activation seal, or any real information to actually pull from. And there's a lot of bitter irony in that. Yuki spent her entire life opposing Tengen's ideology on humanity, even rejecting the role imposed on her as a star vessel, yet in her final fight she entrusted Tengen for a strategy and lost. And that's really all we have for these 4 ghost domains. These final 3, however, are the complete opposite, and were demonstrated beautifully in the series. Moving on to Yuta Okkotsu. While fighting Sukuna directly, Yuta opens Authentic Mutual Love, and his domain filled the area with unlimited katanas, each sword containing 1 copy technique, and Yuta has no idea what that technique is until he grabs a sword and holds it. On top of that, that individual sword disappears after just 1 use. The unlimited supply doesn't necessarily confirm that the technique instantly responds after it's used. What is confirmed is that the unlimited supply is drawn directly from Yuta's arsenal of copy techniques. This uncertainty forces Yuta to have to improvise instead of carefully selecting each tool in advance. Separately, Yuta chooses 1 technique to carry the domain's guaranteed effect. Against Sukuna, he loads Jacob's Ladder into the barrier. The most advanced part of Yuta's domain is his target selection. Yuji is able to fight alongside Yuta in his domain while the guaranteed effect is focused solely on Sukuna. This is the cleanest validated case of a domain targeting 1 person while excluding another. So the domain here is not only defining space, loading a technique, and guaranteeing a hit, but it is actively identifying the receiver in real time. Then Yuta can support that control because his cursed energy reserves are explicitly stated to be so high. Yuta's hand seal is commonly identified as the mudra of Dakini 10. The symbolism here is unusually explicit. The sky is crossed by a massive Mizuhuki cord tied in a Nawaji knot, a knot that is commonly used for weddings and bonds that are intended to remain unbroken. The domain is named Authentic Mutual Love, although the Japanese name also invokes the relationship between the genuine and the counterfeit. Even the domain is a field filled with swords containing copy techniques from other people. That is Yuta's entire character rendered as a landscape. Power begins with the promise that bound him to Rika, and it grows with everything he borrows, takes, and receives from other people. Each sword turns another person's technique into something he can wield on his own. Even the barrier reflects that precision. Yuta can designate Sukuna as the target of his sure hit while fighting alongside Yuji in his domain. Now, where Yuta can discriminate between targets inside of a closed barrier, Sukuna gives up that shell and turns the entire neighborhood into his target. I mentioned this earlier, but Malevolent Shrine manifests without enclosing his target into an outer shell. This forces a binding vow that grants the target an escape route in exchange for a radius of 200 meters. Inside that radius, the domain assigns its attack based on target type. Dismantle attacks objects and targets without cursed energy, Cleave attacks anything with cursed energy, and even adjusts its power to cut him down. That division is why this domain can tear apart buildings and sorcerers at the same time, without treating every part of the scene identically. And with no exterior exterior shell, the opponent cannot end this domain by simply attacking it from the outside. The practical answer is to injure Sukuna until he can no longer maintain it. The open design, however, also gives it a different advantage in domain clashes. Sukuna can always just extend the range of Malevolent Shrine wide enough that he can attack the outside of whatever domain he's clashing with, which is exactly how it repeatedly breaks a limited void at its structurally weaker exterior. The slashes are just the first stage of the attack though. Divine Flame is another technique that Sukuna has, which he used to incinerate Jogo and also kill Mahoraga in one hit. Malevolent Shrine cuts the surrounding area into a huge amount of fine material. Divine Flame is then used to ignite the prepared environment in an effect that the manga explicitly compares to a thermobaric explosion. Against Mahoraga, this produces a blast large enough to destroy it before it can adapt again. Chapter 259 also explains that Sukuna cannot use Divine Flame under every domain configuration. The repeated binding vows and changes to his domain during his fight with Gojo prevented him from using Divine Flame, showing that his binding vows are not simply free upgrades, and that optimizing Shrine for one part of the system closes off another. Now the hand sign pays off the setup from Yuji. As I mentioned previously, Sukuna's hand sign is commonly compared to Yama, or Enmanten in Japanese Buddhism. Yama is known as the king or the judge of the dead, but Yama's role is mainly judgment, as souls arrive before him and he decides the punishment for what they have done. Put that beside Yuji's Shitagarbha reading, and here you have one figure that descends down into hell to free the beings trapped there, and the other presides over the dead and passes judgment. Yuji literally enters Sukuna's inner hell to rescue Megumi. Their signs mirror each other because their characters mirror each other. Similar power, similar body, completely opposite answer to what another person's soul is worth. There is also a popular cooking motif that I love around Divine Flame, Cleave, and Dismantle, supported by the kitchen knife imagery and Sukuna's relationship with eating. Sorry, I've been working on this video for weeks. I'm ready to get down with it. Finally, Gojo's Unlimited Void! This domain brings targets into Limitless itself. Its guaranteed effect overwhelms every process of perception and every thought with endless information. The victim can experience everything but never finish processing a single thing. This leaves them completely conscious but unable to act. And with prolonged exposure, that paralysis becomes lethal. There is one established exemption, as Gojo is not affected by his own sure hit, and anyone maintaining physical contact with Gojo is protected as well. That is why Yuji survives the first demonstration while Gojo holds onto him. Unlimited Void never shows the same targeting capability that Yuta eventually achieves. That limitation becomes the entire problem in Shibuya, where Gojo is underground and has the disaster curses surrounded, but they pack the station with civilians that Unlimited Void would attack indiscriminately. His solution is the famous 0.2 second domain expansion, but that number only describes how long the domain was active, not how quickly he forms it. And the reason Gojo chose 0.2 seconds was because that's what he believed they would even be able to survive. In that fraction of a second, everyone experiences roughly half a year's worth of information, which leaves everybody there unconscious for 2 months. Gojo immediately closes his domain and spends the remaining 299 seconds killing transfigured humans. It's an extraordinary display of precision but not selectivity. Gojo cannot protect the civilians from the sure hit, so he instead calculates just how much they can tolerate. Even the domain carries Buddhist imagery. Unlimited Void appears to draw from the Buddhist sphere of infinite space, a meditative state in which awareness moves beyond the physical form and perceives space as boundless. Gojo turns that transcendence into a weapon. His target is confronted with limitless, but rather than achieving enlightenment, their mind becomes incapable of moving at all. Gojo's one-handed seal is commonly compared to the seal of Taishakuten, the Japanese Buddhist form of Indra. Taishakuten was the ruler of the heavens, and one of Buddhism's great protector deities, retaining the martial authority of Indra. Calling him simply the strongest god would be an oversimplification, but the association is still appropriate. The strongest modern sorcerer opens his domain with the sign of a heavenly ruler, and I love the contrast to Sukuna. Gojo bears the sign of heaven, Sukuna bears the sign of the underworld. But after Unlimited Void injures Sukuna enough that he cannot use his original seal anymore, Sukuna reconstructs Malevolent Shrine using altered conditions and borrows Gojo's one-handed seal. I made a short explaining that this was neuroplasticity, but I never dove into the symbolism behind it. After defeating Gojo, Sukuna takes the sign associated with his greatest rival and makes it part of his own technique. The symbols of heaven and the underworld are no longer held by two opposing figures, and Sukuna now stands alone, using the seal carried by the man once regarded as the strongest. And that's it. That's every domain expansion, the completed ones, the one incomplete one, the ghost domains we don't even see. Yeah. First of all, I'm sorry this video took me a little bit longer. The first time I recorded it, actually, my audio got destroyed and was unusable. So that's my bad. I have a few more of these like explainer type videos written, and I need to record them and edit them. In the meantime, however, I made a poll about this asking you guys what you thought, and nobody said no, which was amazing. But I'm also going to be working on a maker video in the meantime. Now, I keep stressing that I'm an engineer, but I feel like I have more to offer than just explaining anime, you know? And yeah, it'll be really cool. Anyways, exciting things coming soon. Subscribe.